Revolutionary greetings, y'all. My name is Nova Shakur. My pronouns are they, them. I am a member of the All African People's Revolutionary Party. I'm happy to be joined here today by Dr. Gerald Horne, my fellow party comrade Inemesit Richardson. Before we get started, I'm just going to do official introductions for them both. Then we'll get into some questions. But today's conversation is going to be about some recent updates as it pertains to Venezuela and the United States escalating violence towards the nation and also just generally in the Caribbean region. And then we're also going to have a conversation about Burkina Faso in the AES. To get us started, I want to introduce Dr. Gerald Horne officially. He currently holds the Moore Professorship of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He is an activist, scholar, researcher, archivist, author, historian, attorney, and so much more. Dr. Horne has written at least 50 books. And his latest book, which is available on International Publishers' website, is entitled The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C. from 1800 to 1865. Dr. Horne is also a permanent guest on the radio show The Horne Report, which airs on Black Power 96 Radio on Sundays at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And he also hosts a radio show entitled Freedom Now, which airs on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles on Saturday at 11 a.m. Pacific. Replays both of these shows can actually be found on Activist News Network. Now, our other guest, Inemesit Richardson, is also a comrade with the A-APRP. They are co-founder of the Thomas Sankara Center for African Liberation and Unity, which is a Pan-African leading library and political education center based in Burkina Faso and Niger. She is an organizer with the All African People's Revolutionary Party and All African Women's Revolutionary Union. And as a journalist, she has worked for the Pan-African Media Network, Africa Stream. So again, today's conversation will be about Venezuela, about the Caribbean, about Burkina Faso, and about the AES. So we're actually going to start with Inem. I have a question for you pertaining to Burkina Faso. So on September 2nd, multiple Western media outlets, which includes Democracy Now!, BBC, and CNN, have published articles about Burkina Faso's parliament, essentially updating their family codes, which effectively included the criminalization of homosexuality and homosexual acts amongst the citizens and residents. Notably, many of these articles also included links or references to a similar story about Uganda dating back to 2023. So as someone that lives in and organizes in Burkina Faso in them, can you give us what your perspective is on these updated family codes and how they might affect the Burkina Faso people? And then why do you think these media outlets actually chose to cover this story at this time or around this time?
Thank you. I appreciate this question. I know a lot of people have a lot of questions about this right now. It's something that's on a lot of people's minds. And it's kind of a hard question to answer because, the context of this law and how it was passed and came about in Burkina Faso is just so different from, what people might expect or imagine within the United States or other parts of the world. I think we have to understand that the people, like civil society in these two different parts of the world, are right now analyzing some of these questions in very, very, very different ways. So to give you context, the way I typically hear people discuss this is like President Ibrahim Traoré woke up one day and decided to pass a law, and what he says goes, and that just becomes like, the law of the land. And that's not how it works. As you pointed out, this was something that was passed through the sort of legislative process, but also, unfortunately, the reality is it was actually something that a lot of people, like a lot of organizations and individuals, campaigned for. There have been a lot of they're framed as like anti-homosexuality protests and mobilizations, not just in Burkina Faso, but across the Sahel region over the past several years. And so this law is very much a product of that. There's kind of a movement that pushed this forward. And the reason why is because there's been a big conflation between sort of this LGBT movement or basically like queer existence and imperialism. And I think we have to understand that that's a very deliberate thing that, you know, Western countries are orchestrating right now on the African continent. I mean, they do pretty blatantly and explicitly pass that message. And that leads to these kinds of also movements against or for, I would say, the criminalization of homosexuality. So I'll give you like 2 examples I can think of. And so for the first thing I'll say, like I said, it's not just a Burkina Faso thing. There have been a lot of anti-homosexuality protests in Burkina Faso, but also in Mali, even in Senegal, including organized by, honestly, organizations that are typically anti-imperialist and kind of at the forefront of some of the anti-imperialist struggles. When I was in Senegal, this was several years ago, I was taken to meet an LGBT organization. And, you know, I was told pretty explicitly that they, even though they can't technically legally operate, they do have some protection tied in, you know, in connection to the U.S. embassy. And so there's kind of a relationship where the U.S. is like posturing itself as like the protector of a specifically marginalized group that other people or the entire society is waging, you know, an anti-imperialist struggle against. So it's basically put this particular marginalized community in this corner where it's like the imperialists are kind of like claiming them in a way, and it's like everybody's fighting this struggle. And to give you a very, very explicit example of how this plays out in Burkina Faso, you know, when I first moved to Burkina Faso several years ago, and this was up for like maybe a year, if you went to downtown Ouagadougou, the downtown neighborhood is called Kadiogo, you'll see like the Swedish embassy in the heart of the downtown area. And the Swedish embassy would only fly 2 flags visible from outside of their embassy gates, the Pride flag and the EU flag. And it's the only place, you know, it's the only place in the entirety of Burkina Faso I've ever seen the Pride flag. It was in front of that embassy next to the EU flag. So I really think we need to understand that these Western countries have created a deliberate association between basically like LGBT rights or like existence and themselves. And so when people are waging an anti-imperialist struggle and they're very clear on like who the enemies are in terms of like these Western imperialist powers, I think it's become very easy to scapegoat this particular community. And so, okay, long story short, I'll say all this to say, I really think the unfortunate thing is I don't even know if this law makes things necessarily even less safe than they already kind of have been for a while, in the sense that it was already, you know, with or without the law, an environment that was pretty hostile and not, you know, welcoming or safe to be like openly, you know, queer in the context of Burkina Faso and the Sahel. So yes, the government did like officialize it and institutionalize it, but it's not really like, you know, they just woke up and did this. It's like a very hostile environment, and the law is there, but like I think, you know, in terms of like whether it was safe or not before, I think the actual difference is pretty minimal. And just one last thing I'll say about this, because I think people just really don't understand how different things are. You know, when you're in a context like Burkina Faso, the average person, you know, most people unfortunately do support this. And I just want to say the average person has never, ever met anybody who is like openly coming out and saying that they're like queer. Like most people don't know anybody who is pushing back against this. Not to say they don't exist. I'm saying people are very visible in this context. So most people cannot think of anybody that they know, not only who is like openly queer, but somebody that they know who's like openly saying that like we disagree with this. You know, they don't have that framework. So I've been invited to anti-homosexuality protests before. And I've asked the people like who invited me, like, why would you invite me to this? Like, why would you think I would want to attend? And, you know, they're like, well, you're an anti-imperialist. Like it was to them like a given, like, duh, you're you know, anti-imperialist. This is what we do. And I was like, what makes you think this is about fighting imperialism? And it was a shocking question. I mean, these were like, it was like, wow, I've never even had somebody necessarily pose the question of like, you know, is this an imperialist thing or not? So I just want to say this, it's not like it's not a context where it's like we see a visible group publicly like campaigning against this, and then there's like another group that's not. It's like a context where most people don't know any alternative, and like the people who are impacted by this have a culture kind of like don't ask, don't tell. So it's just very different, I think, from what people imagine. And I think it's unfair to pin it on like Ibrahim Traoré as an individual, which is what I'm seeing.
Yeah, and thank you, man. You provided a lot of clarity, I think. and the way that people should be thinking about this contradiction, because a lot of people from the outside are looking at the situation in Burkina Faso and the Sahel as like a revolutionary Pan-African process that is taking place. But these contradictions are going to come up. And I think the way that you're, sort of contextualizing it is like, it's a different like culture. It's a different way of like socializing. There isn't like you said, a visible oppressed people who are being like targeted, and it's not something that's just coming up because there is a revolutionary process taking place. But it's a more of a reflection of the will of the people, if anything. And so I want to kind of follow up on the part when it comes to like the Western media outlets. Why is it that you think they're specifically covering this parliamentary procedure and activity?
Yeah, I mean, I think this like, so I just want to add something else real quick to what we just said, just to also add context. I mean, we're still talking about, a cultural context that is generally kind of like on a cultural, social level, pretty conservative. And there are a lot of like patriarchal practices and institutions. And when I say that, I mean like, this is a context where it's like everybody is socially expected to like enter into a heterosexual marriage and have children. And that's like that's not even an obligation. Like even staying single is not even like a social norm. And it's also like a context where you don't see like even like heterosexual couples being like romantically affectionate in public, holding hands, these kinds of things. So I really want people to understand, like, this is not to say this is a good thing or that nobody's hurt by this. It's still patriarchy. It's bad. So I don't want to talk like I'm endorsing it, but I just want people to understand, like, this is not like a context where we're having some of the same debates and conversations that are currently happening here in the same way. They exist, but it's just not the same, So I wanted to just clarify that. And I think in terms of how Western media outlets, cover this and the attention they give it, I think to some extent it's natural because, as I mentioned, the United States has positioned itself in certain contexts as like a protector of certain LGBT organizations in the region. I mentioned the Swedish embassy flying the pride flag. I mean, they're not doing that because they care about queer people in Africa. That doesn't make any sense. That was never their goal. Like, that's not an actual geopolitical position. That doesn't do anything for them economically. If it's just like, out of the goodness of their heart, they're doing it because exactly what's happening. This is a way to create a huge rift in how people who, would naturally maybe support an anti-imperialist struggle, maybe would not, if something like this were to come about. I think this is, in a way, this law is a big win for the U.S. and imperialist countries. I think that they really push like African countries to pass these kinds of laws, and then they also have that as like a piece of blackmail that they can use to kind of like manipulate African countries once the laws are passed. And then in a case like this, it's a great way to just basically stifle solidarity, because it's, unfortunately, the progressive forces within these two parts of the world don't have an alignment on this issue. People in Burkina Faso will be very progressive in a lot of ways. They're very clear about imperialism. They may be very clear about Pan-Africanism in terms of Africa unifying. Questions of capitalism, the colonized people should control their resources. These are like really important things. That's the primary contradiction, as we say. But they may not be progressive when it comes to some of these particular social and cultural things. And so it creates a rift in terms of the international anti-imperialist movement. And I think that the Western media really, they're not on the side of the people. So I think that they are really happy to kind of sometimes spread the news, and it is reporting. They are reporting things that are happening that are for real. So my concern is even less about the reporting and the fact that, the way the Western countries are posturing themselves within Africa to begin with as like these sort of like natural allies of, the LGBT movement and how that impacts perception.
Yeah, absolutely. And we know homonationalism for the imperialists as a tool is definitely something that gets used frequently, even when we think about Arab states or states in West Asia, using that to delegitimize and discredit, like, the politics. So I do want to go into the conversation with Venezuela with Dr. Horne. So Dr. Horne, recently, the United States government has been escalating a conflict with Venezuela, deploying warships to the region, committing several deadly airstrikes against Venezuelan citizens, claiming a supposed interest in combating drug trafficking in the region that, without evidence, the US government has accused President Nicolas Maduro of being directly a part of. So recently, the Trump administration have rejected talks with President Maduro, denying the opportunity for diplomatic negotiations over the mounting conflict. So what interest do you think the US government has with specifically framing Maduro as a drug trafficking head of state? And then why would it require deployment of military forces to the region?
First of all, thank you for inviting me. Second of all, I think that what's going on in Venezuela is a reflection of a number of trends. Number one, of course, is that Venezuela has a major repository of petroleum, some of the most significant proven reserves on planet Earth. And given the fact that ExxonMobil has control, more or less, over petroleum reserves in neighboring Guyana, this opens an opportunity for US imperialism to control a good deal of the lifeblood of modern economies, speaking of petroleum, and therefore gain leverage over peers and rivals alike, be they the European Union or China. Second of all, you have to consider what's happening in Venezuela in the context of what is referred to as the emerging national security strategy, which governs the spending of the Pentagon, or the newly Christian Department of War in Washington. And according to press reports, this newly minted strategy will have a concentration and focus on this hemisphere. Now, that may come as a surprise to those who are aware that there is mass hysteria in Washington and on Wall Street about the rise of the economy of the People's Republic of China, not least allied with Russia and the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus. But I think it's also fair to infer that US imperialism is not necessarily capable of confronting Beijing frontally, particularly in light of that impressive military parade marking the 80th anniversary over the victory of Japanese militarism that took place in Beijing just a few days ago. And so my inference is that US imperialism feels that it has to bulk up to a certain degree by seizing or administering control over Venezuela. And it will not stop there because, of course, this will be accompanied by a tightening of the blockade against socialist Cuba, one of Venezuela's closest allies in the hemisphere. However, I'm afraid to say it does not stop there either, because Washington now has at least a stated conflict with the giant of the continent, speaking of South America, speaking of Brazil. You're probably familiar of the eye-watering tariffs imposed on Brazilian exports to the United States of America, particularly coffee, which is having severe knock-on effects with regard to those who buy a cup of Java every morning. The prices are going up. As a matter of fact, you might have noticed that Starbucks is downsizing, which I connect directly to the tariffs on Brazil, a major coffee producer. But also recall that just a few days ago, the Trump of the tropics, speaking of the preceding president of Brazil, Mr. Bolsonaro, was convicted of seeking to execute a coup against incoming President Lula just a few years ago. This stands in stark contrast to the fact that the January 6, 2021 coup plotters in the United States of America were captured on camera trying to prevent the transfer of power, have been pardoned and are now celebrated by the ultra-right wing, whereas in Brazil, contrastingly enough, Mr. Bolsonaro will be spending hard time in prison. This was not pleasing to Mr. Trump or Washington. And I dare say that getting leverage over Venezuela, which of course, like virtually every South American nation, shares a border with Brazil, will give leverage against Brasilia. Not to mention the fact that the United States is now involved in a bailout of their ally, speaking of President Milei in Argentina, for example, whose policies have brought masses to the streets in protest. And once again, as U.S. imperialism is losing control in Argentina, they feel they can compensate by tightening control or seeking to tighten control in Caracas. I should also put this in a wider context that has occurred to me of late. I think what we may be witnessing is the decomposition of U.S. imperialism. And just as when at times an adult matures, they have a reversion to their origins. For example, in Japan, as we speak, there are more adult diapers sold than baby diapers, for example, which is another composition. And so if you look at the grimy and seamy origins of the settler regime in Washington, it stems from a conflict stretching back centuries between His Catholic Majesty in Spain and the Protestant secessionists in London, which ignited a round robin of religious conflicts. His Catholic Majesty came within a whisper of overthrowing the monarchy in London in 1588. And I think that what's happening now with the crisis of U.S. imperialism is precisely this decomposition, which is leading to a reversion to seamy and grimy origins, hence the explosion of religious sectarianism in the wake of the assassination of ultra-rightist icon Charlie Kirk. You saw the funeral in Arizona, which was an explosion of white Christian nationalism. We can also connect this to the fact that the ongoing genocide in Gaza is directly connected not only to Jewish identity politics, speaking of Zionism, another expression of religious sectarianism, but that Israel could not accomplish its malign and malignant objectives without assistance from U.S. imperialism, which of course then brings me to the neighbor of Venezuela, speaking of Colombia. President Petro has spoken out quite vigorously against U.S. actions in Gaza. In fact, during the recent visit he made to New York to speak at the United Nations, he actually counseled U.S. soldiers not to obey orders from the U.S. military, which of course caused his visa to be revoked. So to sum up, what I'm seeking to point out is that this crisis in Venezuela has many different strands, economic strands, geopolitical strands, historic strands. And of course, to cut to the chase, I think it is incumbent upon all of us to step up our activism, but not only step up our activism, but also step up our study. Because as a person who resides in the United States of America, I'm quite concerned with what I perceive is not only a lack of ideological study, but ideological study must be accompanied by keeping a close and careful eye on day-to-day, if not hour-to-hour events. I mean, for example, in the Wall Street Journal, just a day or two ago, there was an article about the Venezuelan expatriate community in South Florida, which has hundreds of thousands of members. Interestingly enough, despite their closeness to Mr. Trump, he's revoked their immigration status. And there's an article about how this is impacting the real estate market of South Florida, because Venezuelans are walking away from their residences and going to who knows where. Now, I inferred from that article that some of them might be returning to Caracas, where they could be an advance guard for this proposed invasion of Caracas. And if you're not following news, of course, you may not be able to pick up on that kind of tidbit, which could be quite useful in terms of resisting this proposed illegal illicit invasion. But I would also counsel the hotheads in Washington that Venezuela will not be a pushover, not least because they have expert assistance from Cuban intelligence, particularly within the military. And so, once again, I think it's incumbent upon all of us to step up our game, so to speak.
Absolutely. I feel like you did cover a lot when it comes to all the geopolitical happenings because, like you said, Dr. Horne, to an extent, folks should be pretty much on a day-to-day basis trying to understand how things are developing throughout the world. Even you talked about the situation in Gaza and kind of understanding where it is now is really important in not only knowing like what direction things are leading globally, and especially within the United States context, like there are these memos coming out of the White House, making these sort of declarations about what domestic terrorist activities are, and essentially this attack on whatever is considered the left in the United States. Anybody who is critical or dissenting of the current administration in the U.S. government. I do want to lead into a question for both of you, and whoever feels called on to answer first is totally fine. But it kind of ties into one of the strands that we were talking about, specifically the economic. So when we think about the relationship between Burkina Faso or even the AES at large in Venezuela and South America, what can y'all anticipate happening essentially between the two countries or the two regions if the United States continues to escalate, whether it's the context of Venezuela, you talked about Cuba, we understand that there's escalation in Gaza continuously, et cetera. So what do y'all think is going to happen when it comes to the relationships between these two regions?
I can touch a little bit on, what's currently happening and also, what's happened even in the past, couple months. So, I'll say, first of all, of the three Alliance of Sahel State countries, Burkina Faso was the first to, establish a close ties to Venezuela. So that was around 2023 when Burkina Faso and Venezuela first called for a joint commission, which led to like a parliamentary friendship group where they're collaborating across various sectors. There's like 26 different collaboration agreements that they've come up with. And so that's everything from like agriculture, education, mining, defense, all sorts of things, even like space technology, resource management, et cetera. A little bit more recently, this is actually in January, this is following. So I was actually in Venezuela in January during the Maduro inauguration. And there were members of Burkina Faso's Legislative Assembly that were there. And they met with the National Assembly of Venezuela. And what came out of that was basically a bilateral agreement for future collaboration, saying that, the Burkina Legislative Assembly would return to Venezuela basically to learn from the National Assembly there and to create also a long-term plan of creating a summit between the two. And then this is like much more recently. And I think this is also, we can contextualize this also with the way things have escalated in terms of the US's targeting of Venezuela. There's also been a strengthening at the same time of relationships to the Sahel. And this is where the other two Alliance of Sahel State countries come in. So this was in August, Mali's foreign minister went to Caracas to meet with the foreign minister of Venezuela. And they also created, discussed collaboration across various sectors. I think this is a newer thing, so I don't know if they actually have the Joint Commission and everything set up. It's very recent. But similar to Burkina Faso, just a very wide array of potential collaboration. One of the things that I took note of during that particular meeting is that they discussed Palestine. That was something that was noted and communicated, that they, were interested in also having some sort of joint, foreign policy posture in defense of Palestine, and also, generally, using that framework of multipolarity, which is a very common framework, both within the ALBA countries and the AES countries. And then, very excitingly, just this week, or in this past week, on the 1st of October, Niger's foreign minister met with President Nicolas Maduro, also in Caracas. And I don't know, I don't have all of the details in terms of what collaborations will come out of that. But what has been announced so far is that they're eliminating visa restrictions. So citizens of Niger and Venezuela can now visit, both countries visa-free. So we're seeing, something that started with a Burkina Faso, Venezuela sort of relationship. Because the AES does have an agreement saying that they have a shared foreign policy, we're seeing that play out. So all three countries now have, very, very friendly relations with Venezuela, mutually beneficial. And, these are two, I guess, parts of the world. They're part of blocs that are, very clear about being targeted by similar forces. And so, I think it makes just a lot of sense. And I think we'll see this continue to strengthen as the two blocs really continue to be targeted sharply by, different, or similar powers. And I think in the AES, it's framed as France / NATO with a lot of Ukrainian intervention in terms of that as well. But it's also, known that the United States is part of that NATO bloc. And, ALBA has that same sort of geopolitical positioning. So, yeah, I think we're going to see it really become strengthened more and more. I mean, multipolarity is like the word of the day within the Sahel. It's something that the leaders are constantly speaking about, and it's something that's been picked up on the grassroots level as the framework of this unfolding struggle within the region.
May I ask the comrade a question? I've been reading press reports about the rise in religious zealotry in the Sahel, and some of the press reports have suggested that there are external actors involved, such as the United Arab Emirates, which is, we know, involved up to its eyeballs in Sudan. Are you able to speak to that or confirm those press reports?
I'm less aware of the involvement of the United Arab Emirates. I've heard about speculation, but I haven't seen anything officially announced from within the AES. And so I tend to wait until there's some sort of official, I guess, declaration in terms of who is backing some of these groups. So what we know for now, for sure, is France's involvement and Ukraine's involvement in terms of supporting these death squads that are operating in the region. That's what's been, basically confirmed without a shadow of a doubt, according to the three leaders of the countries. But I have heard also about the rumors of the UAE.
Thank you.
And Dr. Horne, did you have any insights pertaining to this question? Essentially, about the relationship between Venezuela, Burkina Faso, or just the AES in South America at this point in time?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that there is a possibility that, in light of the fact that many of us are expecting an impending U.S. attack on Iran in conjunction with Israel, not to mention, according to Mr. Trump himself, an escalation of the proxy war in Ukraine, reference his noting Russia as an alleged paper tiger, quote unquote, discussion about sending Tomahawk missiles to Ukraine, reference his referring to Ukraine being supplied with the ability to strike deep inside of Russia. I say all that to say that there is a possibility that, given all of these other escapades involving U.S. imperialism, that what may be involved in Venezuela is a kind of phony war. That is to say, trying to put pressure, external pressure on the regime by these assassinations on the open seas of people in boats, execution without due process of law. With regard to these press reports about U.S. forces already on the ground in Venezuela, which I have been unable to confirm. And if that's the case, then the issue would be external pressure that would then, from their point of view, help to ignite some sort of action by the military. But as I've indicated before, you have the Cubans on the ground who have expert experience in terms of that kind of diabolical plot. And it may not be accidental that that plot has not been ignited to this point. I say all that to say that not only is U.S. imperialism involved in a classic case of overstretch, that is to say, despite spending up to $1 trillion on the military, they may not have the capability to fight 3 conflicts at once. Now, of course, the Pentagon budget suggests that the U.S. should be able to fight 2.5 conflicts simultaneously. But given its rather inglorious record of fighting conflicts, be they in Afghanistan or Libya or elsewhere, or Iraq or elsewhere, this may not be up to the task, particularly given the grumbling inside the U.S. military, which we should pay attention to in light of this spectacle of inviting 800 generals and admirals to Quantico, Virginia, be lectured by Mr. Trump and the so-called Secretary of War, Mr. Hegseth. No applause from the audience, stony-faced. They stared back and stared down those who were addressing them. And given the ongoing purge of Black American generals and admirals, women of various ancestries and the leadership being purged, this may not be the optimal moment for U.S. imperialism to embark on another escapade in South America. That, of course, leads us to underscore what has already been mentioned concerning solidarity not only with Cuba and Colombia, hopefully Brazil, and hopefully, of course, the BRICS nations as well, and not to mention our friends in Africa. Because, of course, despite the fact that Mr. Trump has referred to many Caribbean and African nations as being so-called S-hole nations, there is a modicum, I'm afraid to say, of support for U.S. imperialism in the Caribbean and Africa. Witness the rather unfortunate comments emerging from Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana concerning their welcoming a U.S. intervention in Venezuela. And of course, you have those sorts of retrograde sentiments echoed to a degree from some African nations as well. But once again, we have to try to have a global analysis because as we speak, a key U.S. ally, speaking of Morocco, which, as you know, has taken a keen interest in the Sahel. And of course, this is nothing new. It stretches back to the trans-Saharan African slave trade that goes back centuries, heading to Morocco. And now Morocco is under siege by its own population, for example, which I dare say may circumscribe the ability of Rabat to get involved in activities in the Sahel, which of course would simultaneously be a detriment to Caracas.
Yeah, I actually do want to get into this dialectical relationship between Dr. Horne. I feel like you described it perfectly. This disintegrating empire and how it's lashing out, even when we think about the local, the Secretary of War inciting essentially a domestic war against its own citizens in the United States. But then all around the world, we're seeing instances of resistance amongst youth populations, specifically with Gen Z. So I do want to talk about this a little bit and kind of frame it within, what we've been discussing with the AES in Venezuela. So what do y'all foresee as far as like any resistance efforts between the people who do reside in the Sahel and the people who are in Venezuela or even in the surrounding countries? What do y'all see as far as like a developing resistance in these areas? Because there is this escalation that is coming out of the United States because the empire is disintegrating and just lashing out. So what do y'all think?
Well, I can just say, from the grassroots level, it's actually kind of surprising in the sense that, I've traveled around West Africa. I've been to more than half of the countries in the region. And in terms of global populations, typically you're way less likely to interact with people from Latin America than from like any other part of the world in West Africa. So it's surprising but in other ways not surprising and very positive that when you talk about, the context of, Pan-African and anti-imperialist struggles, Venezuela is very present in terms of grassroots organizing in the Sahel. I mean, a great number of, Pan-African organizations across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger do have very close ties, actually, with groups within Venezuela. So, to give you an example, the Thomas Sankara Center I mentioned, we've been to Venezuela a couple of times just in the past year. And a lot of this is because Venezuela also makes a huge effort to, work with, African organizations across the continent. But, there's also a Pan-African festival that's being organized this coming month in Burkina Faso. Some of people, I don't know if you're following some of the A-APRP news, it's called FIPAN. So it's coming up. There are, Venezuelans living in Caracas who are like co-organizing this. I hope they'll be there present, like physically, because the last couple of years they've been trying to, but they're a part of like the planning of this annual festival that happens in a different West African city every year. Like we have very strong, actually, all things considered, people-to-people connections with Venezuela. And it's not just the Thomas Sankara Center. I can name like so many different organizations that have strong Venezuela connections. So I think we do see this on the grassroots level. On the state level, I gave examples earlier in terms of what that collaboration looks like. When I was there in January, I was told multiple times by people representing, maybe like ALBA Movimientos or like the Simón Bolívar Institute, like there's a very huge interest in having a strong relationship with the Alliance of Sahel States. I think it's just a time where it makes sense. One of the things that I've been saying, especially since I came back from Caracas in January, is that, if we just look at the reality of the world right now in 2025, I just think that there's something that is, still lacking on an international level in terms of like state-to-state connections. And that is like a really formal anti-imperialist bloc that crosses these international boundaries. Like I know we have BRICS, but I don't know. I'm always putting out the call, like it's 2025. Could we have maybe like a tricontinental of the 21st century? I think this is a really interesting time to propose something like that between the, Alliance of Sahel States, ALBA, and the Axis of Resistance, for example, which are these three, anti-imperialist poles in three different corners of the world. So, I mean, that's not me necessarily making a prediction. It's more so a call, I would like to see, some sort of official formal relationship where these bodies work together and say, like, we have this new, like, anti-imperialist international organ because they collaborate. The collaboration's there. It's just not like, there's just like not a body for it,
Mm-hmm. Dr. Horne, you got a response?
Well, you give me a prompt.
Well, I'll say this, kind of like what Comrade Inem was speaking to, this call to action of like going back to the tricontinental days and having this internationalist, like official body, really. Even like you mentioned President Petrov in his speech at the United Nations, his call to action of like, hey, we need to, like globally, we need to send some sort of like armed presence to intervene in this genocide in Gaza. So like, yeah, what do you think as far as like the people's resistance, the development of the people's resistance globally, and its international kind of feeling to it? Because everyone is, I mean, the empire is an empire everywhere. So everybody's resisting the empire in their own conditions and context. But like, there does seem to feel like maybe because of, I don't know, maybe it's like social media and the internet and how we're all like more interconnected. But there does seem to be like an internationalist character to these resistances that are kind of popping up around the world. And they're youthful too. They're also very youthful when we think about Gen Z resistances. So, I mean, I'm sorry if that wasn't a very clear prompt, but
no. I'm on it. I think, well, first of all, I think as we scan the globe, we see a mixed picture. Mm-hmm. On the one hand, reference what we just said about Morocco, for example. Optimistically, I would like to think that this challenges the longevity of the king. That may be overly optimistic, but certainly the regime has been shaken to its core by these demonstrations of the youth in Casablanca, in Tangier, in Rabat, etc. You have something similar unfolding in Madagascar, to the east and to the south, where the government has been shaken to its core, which mirrors what has taken place within the last month in Nepal, for example. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, of course, we see that with regard to Gaza, despite the fact that the resistance in Gaza has fought the Israeli war machine to a standstill, as President France has said more than once when he moved for a kind of recognition of Palestinian state. On October 6, 2023, there were 25,000 fighters in Gaza. In succeeding months, half were killed, but today there are more than 25,000 fighters. And so this has forced Israel and its U.S. patron to the bargaining table. But I'm afraid to say that they have a certain kind of support from erstwhile comrades and allies of the fighters. I'm speaking of Turkey, Qatar, Saudis, etc. But even within the context of that negativity, we would be remiss if we failed to note what has emerged since the piratical Israeli attack on Qatar, the Persian Gulf monarchy, is that in the succeeding Doha summit, you had emerging a de facto, if not de jure, alliance between Pakistan, a nuclear state, and Saudi Arabia, which in some ways calls for mutual assistance if, for example, the Israelis are so audacious as to attack the Saudis. So I say that all to say that with regard to that part of the world, speaking of Africa into West Asia, there's a certain kind of ferment which at least should tie down the imperialists, I would hope. With regard to the hemisphere, Mexico is always a party that we need to consider. And of course, Mr. Trump has threatened to bomb Mexico, which has not gone down well in Mexico City. We see that in the United States of America, as part of what I refer to as this ongoing war against the Spanish-speaking populations, a reversion to the grimy and seamy origins of Anglo-American imperialism, the High Court has suggested that it's legitimate to racially profile those who speak Spanish. That even if you're a U.S. citizen carrying a U.S. passport, you can be detained, stopped, and frisked because speaking Spanish is seen as an indicator or an emblem of not necessarily being part of the United States of America, which is obviously going to enrage many of Mexican origin. You can see that unfolding as we speak, where you've had raucous manifestations and demonstrations with the National Guard now being sent to the state despite protestations from both the mayor and the governor of Illinois. On the other hand, in Ecuador, you have a U.S. ally, speaking of President Noboa, but he has been tied down by protests in his own country, and therefore it's unclear what kind of assistance he will be able to lend to any sort of U.S. intervention in Caracas. I say all that to say that there is a mixed picture. It would be an error to think that our side, the progressive forces, the radical forces, are on the march in an untrammeled fashion, in an unchallenged fashion. But on the other hand, there are signs that protest is erupting, imperialists are being tied down, and this is circumscribing their ability to respond.
Thank you both for y'all's answers, because I mean, really, y'all painted a really clear and global picture of like there is resistance and there's something tangible to give us revolutionary hope to sustain us. So I feel like y'all have really great responses. I just have a few more questions for y'all, and we're going to wrap up. So one of our closing questions is, what ways must we as Africans throughout the diaspora show material support and solidarity when it comes to Venezuela, but also when it comes to the revolutionary process taking place in the Sahel? And either one of you can take that on.
Okay, I mean, in terms of like showing up from, and providing material support, I mean, the Thomas Sankara Center, I think, is already a great example of that because, we've been able to do so much in terms of revolutionary Pan-African political and ideological education within the Sahel. And it's through, grassroots funding, through the solidarity of, comrades from all around the world who, have been able to show up and provide that support. So if people are interested in that, I encourage people to check out Burkina Books on Instagram, or also Burkina Books on Patreon. But I also want to add, I think the other piece there is kind of looping us back to that first question, which is in terms of like, with the law that was recently passed, like I know a lot of people are, there's a lot of people who are more reticent, or a lot of people who feel like, they want to pull back their support, given the anti-homosexuality law that was, or aspects of the family code. And I just want to, talk on that again real quick, just to say that, we have to arrive at a position where we understand that anti-imperialism is unconditional, in the sense that, the same way that slavery, genocide, these are things that are unconditional. Like, regardless of what any people believe, I would never say like, okay, they deserve to be enslaved or they deserve genocide. Well, the same goes for colonialism as well as neo-colonialism, which is how imperialism manifests in Africa for the most part. And I just want to kind of hammer on this a little bit because I think it's really important as people grapple with this. For example, I believe that women, that people who can carry children and give birth should have the right to choose whether or not to terminate a pregnancy or to carry it to term. That's a belief I have. Like, I believe that should, it's a principle and everything. But, if I were to go right now, maybe to the Democratic Republic of the Congo and survey people all over the place, I might realize that the majority of people might not hold that same position as me. That doesn't mean then that my position is that, okay, M23 should come and just, free reign, do whatever you want there. And I know people don't necessarily think about things in that kind of black and white way, but that's kind of where the Sahel's at in the sense where it's like you either support the Alliance of Sahel States or you support death squads that are, that have been attacking this part of the world for several decades. And so we really have to be very clear. And I also just want to touch further on that in the sense that, when we think about how some of these social contradictions have been addressed in the United States, they've been addressed for the most part relatively like organically. Like Stonewall is a part of a social movement that emerged from within the United States. There was no other country that was like pushing like or funding, any of the actors at Stonewall to do what they did. That was organic and something that emerged from that specific context. And I realized that like within the United States, very few people seem to, well, a lot, it's not, I won't say it that way. I'll say some people or some sectors of the society don't seem able to afford other countries that sort of respect to like have their own sort of organic internal struggles that will emerge. I mean, how different would it have been if this question had been something where it was like an external power was the one to like kind of push it? Like, how would that perceive our own ability to understand that particular struggle within the context of the U.S.? I think it would change a lot in terms of how people, understand it. And so I think we need to just be able to understand that we have to let other people and other places in the world like organically wage these kinds of struggles. And, if you're living in an imperial country, you have to just, like I said, unconditionally oppose imperialism under all circumstances. And also just one last note on that, if you really think about it, like if people treat this like imperialism as this like negotiable thing or like this conditional thing, like you do X, Y, and Z, or we'll stop, being with you or being on your side. And they treat like this LGBT or like queer struggle this way. It just kind of reinforces this already, what the West is basically telling people, which is that this is us and this is our struggle. Because they're going to be seeing people in the West acting like that's what it is. Like we're West, that's how it reads. Like we're Westerners. We want you to do what is the Western thing, and that our support is conditioned upon you supporting something that, we're claiming as our own. And if you posture it that way, it just perpetuates this the same thing. So I just wanted to come full circle there, because I know that's like in the past couple months been the biggest thing that's kind of like shook people's support for the struggle unfolding across the Sahel. And so we have to be very clear in how we like position ourselves and our arguments, so that we're not setting ourselves up the same way the US already does, and also that we're treating the question of imperialism like an absolute non-negotiable. Like no context in which we could ever side with the imperial power.
Yeah. Dr. Horne, you have a response as well?
Well, I would just say that with regard to support, my understanding is you folks are in Southern California, if I'm not mistaken, correct?
Oh, I'm in Houston.
Whoa.
Gotta represent.
Because I was going to suggest that the folks in Southern California make a beeline to Westwood, the federal building, and begin organizing manifestations, protests, demonstrations there. Of course, that's the site of federal power, Washington, D.C. power, Trump power in your neighborhood. You have a similar facility in Houston, for example, for the folks there as well. And of course, this could either be a sort of party effort, or it could be a party initiated effort whereby you try to rally the like-minded in various constituencies, and the labor movement, in the Black liberation movement, and allied movements, to join you in this manifestation of solidarity with Venezuela under the banner that has stood the test of time for decades, hands off Venezuela. Just as one time we raised the slogan of hands off Cuba, hands off Angola, for example. And that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, absolutely. Hands off the Sahel, hands off Palestine. Like Comrade Inem said, there's no condition to being anti-imperialist, and there shouldn't be any conditions. We shouldn't allow for other countries and the way that they go through political processes to determine whether or not the U.S. can intervene for its own interests. So thank you both so much for y'all's time. I do have one final question, is just so we can know what's next for both of you. Comrade Inem, I know you were at Africa Stream before it got deplatformed, and I know you're a writer. So what is next for you exactly? Are you going to be in Burkina Faso at Burkina Books, or what do you have coming up?
Yeah, definitely. So I'm definitely still going to be involved in Burkina Books / the Thomas Sankara Center. So like I said, you can check us out, Burkina Books, on Instagram or on Patreon. Our Facebook's like mostly in French, so probably not super helpful, but I would check out those two. And yeah, I still have media appearances that are programmed, so please stay tuned and check those out. I think there's going to be a lot of exciting updates coming from the Sahel even in the coming months. So please keep paying attention to the Sahel. I know that African Stream was heavily censored, but that doesn't mean we stop paying attention. It just means that it might get a little harder, but we're still finding ways to get that information out there. And then there's other media platforms that are also popping up, and I will be collaborating with some of them in the months to come. So please, check that out. I don't know if I can say which ones yet, but yeah.
I think I know what you're talking about. We were really excited the other day.
Yeah.
Dr. Horne, what about yourself? What do you have coming up?
Well, on Friday in Brooklyn at 6:30 p.m. Eastern at Sister's Place on Nostrand Avenue, I'm doing a book signing for my latest book, The Capital of Slavery, Washington, D.C., 1800 to 1865. And the following Friday, October 17th, at Montgomery College in Silver Spring, Maryland, around the same time, a book signing for the same book. And I should also say that the latest edition, or a new edition, of a book I published some years ago, Blows Against the Empire, U.S. Imperialism and Crisis, just dropped a few days ago. It gives a sort of panoramic view of the state of the movement, the state of opposition to the movement, etc. That can be easily accessed. And of course, in 2026, I have a number of publications lined up to drop, but I'll stop there.
Yeah. Again, thank you both so much for y'all's time, for this opportunity to have this conversation. I mentioned earlier, and I didn't even contextualize. Again, I'm with the All African People's Revolutionary Party. We are a Pan-African organization. Our objective is the total unification of Africa under scientific socialism. So again, like, we wanted to have this conversation to sort of frame, like, what should Africans be thinking about, how we should be analyzing the things that are happening in the world, and how can we move forward. So thank you again so much for your insights, and I hope y'all have a great day.
Good luck to you.
Thank you. Forward ever.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.